Pack your things, Julian, you're redundant, Bradley Vance sneered, tossing a thin blue folder across the mahogany table. I looked at the termination papers, then at the digital clock on the wall. Friday, 4 p.m. The corporate offices of Vance Logistics were quiet, save for the hum of the HVAC and the smug grin on Bradley's face. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't plead. I simply reached over, shut my ThinkPad, and stood up. Understood, I said quietly, sliding the folder into my leather briefcase. Bradley let out a soft, mocking laugh, thinking he had finally purged the old guard to clear the way for his grand $450 million IPO. He had no idea that he had just signed the death warrant of his own family empire. Without my signature, and without the 127,000 lines of proprietary routing code running silently in the server room down the hall. Every freight truck, customs clearance, and warehouse sorter in the Vance network would grind to a halt before the market opened on Monday. To understand how a 34-year-old MBA graduate with zero operational experience could make such a catastrophic mistake, you have to go back 28 years. In 1998, I was a 24-year-old systems engineer, fresh out of college when Walter Vance hired me. Back then, Vance Logistics wasn't a multi-state freight giant with an $85 million annual revenue. It was a struggling local carrier with 12 trucks, a leaky warehouse in Savannah, Georgia, and a mountain of debt. Walter was a hard-nosed, practical logistics man who knew everything about diesel engines and highway routes, but absolutely nothing about computers. He saw something in me and gave me complete creative control over our IT infrastructure. For the first decade, I worked 80-hour weeks building our digital backbone from scratch. In 2008, when the logistics industry began moving toward automation, Walter wanted to purchase a commercial enterprise resource planning system. The quotes from Oracle and SAP were astronomical, well over $3 million. Vance Logistics was struggling after the housing market crash, and we simply didn't have the capital. I went to Walter with a proposal. I told him I would build a custom, proprietary middleware engine that would integrate our dispatch, warehouse inventory, GPS tracking, and customs compliance into a single unified platform. The only condition was that I would build it on my own time, using my own personal equipment, and I would retain sole intellectual property rights. Walter, desperate to save his company, agreed. We signed a formal software licensing agreement, drafted by a local intellectual property lawyer. The terms were clear. Vance Logistics received an exclusive, non-transferable license to use the software, dubbed Nexus 127, for as long as I remained an active employee of the company. If my employment was terminated for any reason, the license would automatically revoke within 48 hours, and all rights to the code would revert solely to me. Over the next 2 years, I wrote exactly 127,000 lines of clean, optimized C++ and Python code. Nexus 127 automated the entire workflow, communicating directly with the U.S. Customs database using electronic data interchange status messages. It managed the automated guided vehicles in our Savannah warehouse, routed our fleet of 200 trucks using real-time traffic telemetry, and calculated optimal fuel stops. It was the nervous system of Vance Logistics. By 2026, I was 52 years old, serving as the chief logistics architect. Walter had retired the previous year, leaving the company in the hands of his son, Bradley. Bradley was the definition of nepotism. He had spent his 20s bouncing from one elite business school to another, accumulating degrees but zero practical knowledge. To him, logistics wasn't about drivers, dispatchers, or custom codes. It was just numbers on a spreadsheet. Almost immediately after taking the CEO chair, Bradley hired Harvey Fletcher, a ruthless corporate cost-cutter, as our new chief financial officer. Together, they developed a plan to prepare Vance Logistics for a private equity buyout and subsequent IPO, aiming for a valuation of $450 million. But to achieve that valuation, they needed to show massive short-term cost reductions. They looked at the payroll and saw my salary. As chief logistics architect with nearly 3 decades of seniority, I was earning a premium wage. Why are we paying Julian Mercer $250,000 a year, plus bonuses just to watch a system that already runs itself? Harvey had asked during a closed-door board meeting, unaware that my assistant was taking minutes. Bradley, eager to prove himself smarter than his father, agreed. They assumed that because Nexus 127 had been running flawlessly for 18 years, it was company property and required no further maintenance. They planned to replace my entire department with a cheap, outsourced IT help desk based in Eastern Europe. On that fateful Friday afternoon, Bradley called me into the executive boardroom. He didn't offer me a seat. He simply handed me the severance package, which offered a measly 2 weeks of pay for every year of service capped at 10 weeks. "We're restructuring the operations department, Julian," Bradley said, leaning back in his leather chair and swirling a glass of sparkling water. "Your role has been deemed redundant. We've hired an external firm, Tech Global Solutions, to handle the software management going forward. We'll need your administrator credentials before you leave today." I looked at the severance document. Under Section 4, it stated that I waived all future claims against the company. I looked at Bradley's smug expression and then at Harvey, who was checking his gold watch. They had no idea that they were standing on a landmine of their own making. "I won't be signing the severance agreement," I said, putting it back on the table. "That's your choice," Bradley replied, his tone hardening, "but your termination is effective immediately, and we still need those administrator credentials. The company owns the server room, Julian. Don't make this difficult." "The company owns the hardware, Bradley," I replied, maintaining a calm, even tone. "You own the servers, the fiber optic cables, and the office chairs, but you do not own the software running on them." Bradley laughed, a sharp, arrogant sound. "We've been using that system for nearly 2 decades. It's built into our operations. Our legal team says any work done during your tenure belongs to Vance Logistics under the work-for-hire doctrine. Now give us the admin passwords, or we will have security escort you out." "You don't need my passwords to access the hardware," I said, closing my briefcase. "Your new outsourcing team can log in, but I suggest you read your father's original contracts before you commit to this path." Without another word, I walked out of the boardroom. I didn't make a scene. I didn't scream or slam doors. I walked down to my office, packed my personal belongings into a single cardboard box, and handed my security badge to the receptionist. As the heavy glass doors of the Vance Logistics headquarters closed behind me, I checked my phone. It was 4:30 p.m. The countdown had begun. Under the terms of the 2008 Nexus 127 licensing agreement, Vance Logistics had exactly 48 hours of authorized software usage remaining. On Sunday at 4:30 p.m., the license would officially expire. On Monday morning, the logistics giant would wake up to a silent, paralyzed empire. I spent Friday evening in the study of my suburban home, enjoying a glass of 20-year-old bourbon and watching the setting sun paint the Savannah sky in hues of orange and purple. For the first time in 28 years, I had nowhere to be on Monday morning. I felt a profound sense of peace, but it was the calm before a digital hurricane. I wasn't just sitting idle, though. I had work to do. On my desk sat my personal workstation, a dual-boot Linux machine connected to a secure network storage drive. This drive held the original source repository of Nexus 127, complete with the digital signature and copyright registration certificate issued by the United States Copyright Office in 2009. I had regularly updated the copyright registrations for every major version release. Vance Logistics owned the physical servers located at their Savannah hub, but they only had a compiled binary executable running on those machines. They did not have the source code, and they certainly did not have the right to modify or run the software once the license expired. While I was enjoying my quiet evening, chaos was already starting to brew at the Vance Logistics headquarters. Bradley had wasted no time. By Friday at 5:30 p.m., the Tech Global Solutions onboarding team, led by a remote systems manager named Grigori, had logged into the Vance network. Bradley had promised them a seamless transition, claiming the logistics system was a standard commercial-grade package. Grigori and his team of remote developers quickly discovered the horrifying truth. Nexus 127 was not a standard package. It was a massive custom-built web of C++ and Python scripts that interacted directly with hardware PLCs, automated sorting belts, and regional customs databases. Because I had designed the system to be highly secure, the source code was obfuscated, and the executable files checked a remote license validation server every 48 hours to verify my active employee status. This license check was hard-coded into the core database access layer. If the check failed, the system would automatically revoke all database access tokens, rendering the user interface completely useless. By midnight on Friday, Grigori sent an urgent email to Bradley. The remote team was baffled. They couldn't locate the source code repository on the company's servers, and they didn't understand why the system's APIs were throwing warning messages about a pending security certificate expiration. Bradley, asleep at his estate, ignored the email. On Saturday morning, I met with my intellectual property attorney, Sarah Jenkins, at her Savannah office. I laid out the original 2008 software agreement, my employment contract, my termination letter, and the copyright certificates for Nexus 127. Sarah reviewed the documents with a smile. "Julian, this is an absolute goldmine," she said. Section 7 clearly states that the software license is tied to your active employment and terminates automatically 48 hours after your departure. There is no grace period or transition clause. Bradley's legal team must have been asleep when they approved your firing. They didn't even consult their legal team, I explained. Bradley and Harvey wanted to keep this firing quiet and quick to show immediate savings before the private equity audit on Monday. They assumed they owned everything. Well, they are about to learn a very expensive lesson in federal copyright law, Sarah said. She immediately began drafting a formal cease and desist notice. The letter was addressed directly to Bradley Vance, CEO of Vance Logistics. It stated in clear, uncompromising legal terminology that the company's license to use the Nexus 127 software would expire on Sunday at 4:30 p.m. Any continued execution of the software, database queries, or routing automation after that time would constitute willful copyright infringement under Title 17 of the United States Code. The letter cited 17 U.S.C. 504, warning that statutory damages for willful infringement could reach up to $150 per day, in addition to an immediate federal injunction to shut down their operations. We sent the letter via email with read receipt tracking, and also hired a professional courier to deliver a physical copy directly to Bradley's private residence by Saturday afternoon. At 2 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a red receipt. Bradley had opened the email. 5 minutes later, the physical courier confirmed delivery. Instead of panic, Bradley's response was sheer, unadulterated arrogance. He didn't call his corporate counsel. Instead, he forwarded the email to Harvey Fletcher with a brief note. "Julian is panicking. He's using some old contract my dad signed to try and shake us down for a bigger severance. Ignore him. Grigori's team will have full control of the servers by Monday anyway." Harvey, equally ignorant of software IP law, agreed. He replied, "Agreed. We cannot let a retired developer derail the IPO. The private equity auditors from Vanguard Group are arriving Monday morning at 9 a.m. We need the system running smoothly. Tell Tech Global to ignore Julian's legal threats and keep the operations running." On Saturday evening, I monitored the public API endpoints of Vance Logistics from my home computer. The system was already showing signs of strain. Grigori's team was trying to bypass the license check by modifying the local server configuration files. They didn't realize that the database had an integrity check. Every time they tried to tamper with the system files, Nexus 127 recorded the unauthorized modification and locked down a secondary database table. By Sunday morning, the automated commercial environment interface at the Port of Savannah began flagging Vance Logistics shipments. The customs brokers were receiving automated error messages because the system's electronic data signatures did not match my registered credentials. The customs clearing process, which usually took minutes, was beginning to slow to a crawl. At 4 p.m. on Sunday, I sat at my desk with a cup of black coffee, watching the countdown timer I had set on my screen. 30 minutes remained. I checked the Vance network status one last time. They were still running the software. They had ignored the cease and desist. They truly believed I was bluffing. At exactly 4:29 p.m., the remote license validation server sent its final query to the Vance Logistics database. The response returned a null value for Julian Mercer's active employment status. At 4:30 p.m., the system executed the hard-coded safety protocol. The database tokens expired. The user interfaces in every warehouse, dispatch office, and truck terminal went completely blank. The 127,000 lines of code had officially entered lockdown. The giant was dead. The Sunday evening shift at the Savannah distribution hub began at 6 p.m. It took less than 15 minutes for the first signs of total system failure to manifest. Inside the massive 400,000 square foot warehouse, the automated guided vehicles, robotic carriers that glided along magnetic strips to transport pallets of goods, suddenly ground to a halt. Their amber warning lights began to flash in unison. The automated conveyor system, which sorted thousands of packages per hour using high-speed optical scanners, stopped with a heavy mechanical groan. The touchscreen terminals used by the warehouse staff to log inventory and print shipping labels cleared, replaced by a stark red message: database connection to terminated. License Liller expired. At the dispatch desk in Jacksonville, Florida, the night operations manager, a veteran named Marcus? No, Marcus is excluded. Let's name him Peter Vance? No, Peter is fine. Let's use * Peter Vance. Wait, Vance is the family name. Let's name the night manager * Gary Thompson. Gary tried to access the truck routing console to assign drivers to the midnight long-haul runs. The screen was completely locked. The GPS tracking board, which normally showed the live coordinates of 200 trucks across the eastern seaboard, was offline. Gary immediately called the IT help desk, which routed him to Tech Global's support center. The technician had no idea what was happening. He tried rebooting the local database servers, but they queried the remote license server again, failing once more. By 8 p.m., the situation escalated from an IT glitch to an operational crisis. Frantic phone calls began flooding Bradley Vance's private cell phone. "Bradley, the entire Savannah warehouse is dead," Gary Thompson reported, his voice tight with panic. "The AGVs aren't moving, the conveyors are locked, and we can't load any outbound trailers. We have 42 trucks waiting in the yard, and the line is starting to spill out onto the main highway. If we don't get the dispatch system up, we're going to miss the Monday morning delivery window for Omnimart." Omnimart was Vance Logistics' largest client, accounting for nearly 40% of their annual revenue. Under the terms of the Omnimart contract, Vance Logistics was subject to a penalty of $50,000 for every hour of delayed delivery, and any failure to maintain a 99.8% on-time delivery rate over a 48-hour period gave Omnimart the legal right to terminate the contract immediately without penalty. Bradley, panicking but refusing to admit his mistake, called Grigori, the Tech Global Systems manager. "Why is the system down?" Bradley shouted into the phone. "I pay your company $20,000 a month to manage this. Fix it." "Mr. Vance, we are trying," Grigori replied, his voice tense. "But your former IT director did not leave us standard code. The system is run by a proprietary engine. The database is encrypted, and the decryption keys are tied to a remote verification server that we cannot access. We tried to bypass the security check by rewriting the server configuration, but the system detected the intrusion and locked down the database schema. If we try to force it, we risk corrupting the entire database. We need the source code and the administrator decryption keys. Does your company have them?" "We don't have the source code," Bradley screamed. "Mercer has it. Just hack past it. You're software engineers, aren't you?" "It is not that simple, Mr. Vance," Grigori explained. "Without the source repository and the documentation, it would take a team of senior developers months to reverse engineer this system. And if we attempt to bypass it illegally, your company could face federal hacking charges for violating the DMCA." Bradley slammed the phone down. He finally realized the gravity of his situation. He pulled up his email and found the cease and desist letter from Sarah Jenkins that he had ignored on Saturday. He read the citation of 17 U.S.C. paragraph 504. The statutory damages for willful infringement were astronomical. Desperate, Bradley dialed my personal number. The call went straight to voicemail. He tried again from a different phone, but I had set my device to block all unknown numbers. He then sent a flurry of text messages, moving from demands to threats. "Julian, you need to turn the system back on immediately. You are sabotaging company property. This is a criminal offense. If the system is not up by midnight, I will contact the police and file a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against you." I read the text on my tablet while sitting in my living room, sipping a hot cup of chamomile tea. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the screenshots of the messages to Sarah Jenkins. By 11 p.m., Sarah sent a formal legal response to Bradley's corporate counsel and to Bradley directly. The letter was short, cold, and devastating. Mr. Vance, your text messages to my client constitute harassment and a fundamental misunderstanding of intellectual property law. My client is not sabotaging Vance Logistics. He is simply no longer providing the software license that was contractually tied to his employment. The license expired naturally 48 hours after you terminated his employment for redundancy. Furthermore, be advised that any attempt by your outsourced IT firm, Tech Global Solutions, to bypass the encryption or tamper with the database of the Nexus 127 software constitutes a direct violation of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA, and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 30. If your company continues to run the unauthorized binary code after the license expiration, we will seek an immediate federal injunction on Monday morning to seize your servers, alongside statutory damages of $150,000 per violation. While the lawyers traded emails, the operational collapse of Vance Logistics was spreading across the country. At the port of Savannah, 6 cargo ships containing import containers destined for Vance warehouses were being unloaded, but the customs clearance system was frozen. The Automated Commercial Environment Database rejected all Vance customs filings because the electronic signatures, which were tied to my personal customs broker credentials, were inactive. The Port Authority refused to release the containers. The demurrage fees, penalties for storing containers at the port past their allowed time, began accumulating at a rate of $300 per container per day. Vance had over 500 containers sitting on the docks. At the Canadian border in Detroit, Michigan, a line of 15 Vance trucks was denied entry. The drivers couldn't present the required electronic manifest data because the dispatch server was offline. The trucks were forced to pull over, blocking the highway lanes and drawing fines from the state police. By 3 a.m. on Monday, Bradley Vance was sitting in his darkened office, surrounded by half-eaten takeout and printouts of financial reports. His phone was ringing constantly. Harvey Fletcher sat opposite him, his face pale. The private equity auditors from the Vanguard Group were scheduled to arrive in 6 hours. The IPO was supposed to be the crowning achievement of Bradley's career. Instead, he was looking at the complete, catastrophic collapse of a 28-year-old company in less than 12 hours. Monday morning at 8:11 a.m. arrived like a wrecking ball. At the Vance Logistics headquarters, the atmosphere was thick with dread. The digital dashboard in the lobby, which usually displayed live operational metrics, was black. Upstairs in the executive wing, the phones were ringing in an endless, discordant chorus. Every line was busy. Customers, regional warehouse managers, truck drivers, and port authorities were all calling for answers. The most devastating call came from Brenda Cole, the director of global supply chain for Omnimart. She bypassed the reception desk and dialed Bradley's direct office line. Bradley answered on the first ring, his voice trembling. "Bradley, where the hell are our shipments?" Brenda demanded, her voice cold and cutting. "We have 14 distribution hubs across the Midwest that were scheduled to receive automated shipments of high-margin consumer electronics and perishables between 5:00 a.m. and 7. Not a single Vance truck has arrived. Our shelves are going to be empty by this afternoon." "Brenda, I apologize," Bradley stammered, rubbing his temples. "We are experiencing a temporary network outage. Our IT team is working on it as we speak, and we expect—" "I don't care about your network, Bradley," Brenda interrupted. "I care about our contract. You have exactly 4 hours to get those trucks to our docks. If they are not there by noon, we are activating Clause 14. We will terminate our agreement with Vance Logistics for default, and we will hold you liable for every dollar of lost retail sales. That is $48 million in annual business, Bradley. If you ruin our supply chain, we will ruin your company." Before Bradley could respond, the line went dead. At 9 a.m., the situation went from critical to terminal. The private equity audit team from the Vanguard Group, led by a senior partner named Leonard Cox, arrived at the office. They were scheduled to begin their due diligence review for the $450 million IPO. Instead of a smooth, highly automated logistics powerhouse, they walked into a scene of absolute pandemonium. In the main dispatch room, 20 employees were frantically writing truck routes on dry erase whiteboards, trying to coordinate 200 shipments using manual spreadsheets and personal cell phones. The CFO, Harvey Fletcher, was in the corner, screaming at a port customs officer on his mobile. Leonard Cox stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the chaotic room. He turned to Bradley, who had rushed down to meet them. "Mr. Vance, what is going on here?" Leonard asked, his eyebrows raised. "Just a minor system maintenance window, Mr. Cox." Bradley lied, his shirt collar damp with sweat. "We'll be back to full automation within the hour." Leonard Cox wasn't fooled. He walked over to a dispatch station and looked at the red screen displaying the license expiration notice. He read the words aloud: Nexus 127 software license expired. Author, Julian Mercer. Leonard turned back to Bradley, his face expressionless. "We are pausing the due diligence audit, Bradley. The Vanguard Group does not invest in companies that do not own the proprietary software driving their core operations. If this software belongs to a former employee, your corporate valuation is not $450 million. It is zero. We are returning to Atlanta. Do not contact us until you have resolved this ownership issue." As the Vanguard team walked out of the building, Bradley felt the walls closing in. Harvey Fletcher ran over, his face pale. "Bradley, Omnimart just sent a formal notice. They are preparing to pull their account. And Tech Global says they can't bypass the encryption without corrupting the database. We are facing complete liquidation by the end of the week." "Call my father," Bradley whispered, his voice cracking. "He's the only one Julian will listen to." At 10:30 a.m., a familiar black sedan pulled into the driveway of my suburban home. The driver's side door opened, and Walter Vance stepped out. He was 76 years old, walking with a wooden cane, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. I met him on the front porch. I felt a pang of sadness seeing my old friend and mentor looking so weary, but I stood my ground. "Walter," I said, greeting him. "Julian." Walter sighed, leaning on his cane. "I suppose you know why I'm here." "I do," I replied, opening the screen door. "Come inside. I've made some coffee." We sat in my kitchen, the steam rising from our mugs. For a few minutes, we sat in silence. Finally, Walter shook his head. "My son is an idiot, Julian," Walter said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "He thought he could run a logistics company with spreadsheets and MBA buzzwords. He forgot that this business is built on trust, loyalty, and the people who write the code. He showed me the legal letter your lawyer sent. He's terrified." "He should be," I said calmly. "He fired me for redundancy to inflate his IPO numbers. He wanted to steal the software I spent 18 years developing and replace my team with cheap outsourced labor." "I know," Walter said, placing a hand on the table. "And I don't blame you for locking it down. I signed that 2008 agreement, Julian. I knew exactly what it meant. I trusted you then, and I trust you now. But I spent 40 years building Vance Logistics. If the system stays down, the company will be bankrupt by Friday. I'm asking you, as an old friend, to help me save it. Not for Bradley, but for the hundreds of drivers and warehouse workers who will lose their livelihoods." I looked at Walter. I respected him too much to lie. "I won't let Bradley ruin my life's work, Walter. But I will not hand over my software to be exploited by him and Harvey. If you want the system back online, it will be on my terms. And those terms are non-negotiable." "Tell me," Walter said. I pulled out a printed document from my desk drawer, a draft agreement that Sarah Jenkins and I had prepared over the weekend. I slid it across the table to Walter. "First," I said, "Bradley and Harvey must deliver a formal written apology to me, admitting their attempt to steal my intellectual property. Second, Harvey Fletcher must be terminated from his role as CFO immediately. He is a parasite." Walter nodded slowly. "Consider it done. I still control 40% of the voting shares, and with your support we can override Bradley." "What else?" "Third," I continued, "Vance Logistics will sign a new software licensing agreement for Nexus 127. The annual licensing fee will be $500,000, paid in advance every year. Fourth, I will not return as an employee. I will act as an independent systems consultant under a 5-year contract with an annual retainer of $200,000 paid monthly. And finally, Bradley must sign a personal guarantee for the licensing fees. If he tries to bankrupt the company to escape the debt, he will pay me out of his own pocket. Walter read through the document. A faint smile appeared on his weathered face. You really nailed him to the wall, didn't you? He tried to steal my code, Walter, I replied. This is just the cost of doing business. Walter stood up, using his cane for support. He dialed a number on his phone and put it on speaker. Bradley, Walter said when his son answered. Get over to Julian's house right now and bring your checkbook. The survival of your company depends on it. 30 minutes later, Bradley Vance arrived at my house. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His tie was loosened, his hair was disheveled, and the arrogance that had defined his posture on Friday was completely gone. He was accompanied by Oliver Banks, the corporate lawyer, who carried a leather portfolio containing the corporate seal. Bradley walked into my kitchen, his eyes darting between me and his father. He opened and closed his mouth, trying to find words, but Walter pointed a stern finger at the chair opposite me. Sit down, Bradley, Walter commanded, and don't say a word unless it's to agree to Julian's terms. Bradley sank into the wooden chair, looking incredibly small. Oliver Banks sat next to him, opening the portfolio and reviewing the draft contract I had provided to Walter. Mr. Mercer, Oliver Banks began, his voice professional and measured. We have reviewed the proposed software licensing agreement and the consulting contract. While we understand the leverage you hold, an annual licensing fee of $500,000 is significantly above market rate for middleware software. It isn't middleware advanced logistics, Oliver, I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. It is the entire operating system. Without Nexus 127, your trucks don't move, your warehouses don't sort, and your customs clearances don't process. If you think the price is too high, you are welcome to build your own system from scratch. I'm sure Tech Global can have it ready for you in, what did they say, Grigori? 6 months? A year? Of course, you'll have to explain to Omnimart why their shelves are empty for the next year, and you'll have to tell the Vanguard Group why your IPO is canceled. Oliver Banks looked at Bradley, then at Walter. He knew when he was beaten. The fee is acceptable, the lawyer muttered, checking a box on his tablet. But the personal guarantee from Bradley, that is highly irregular for a corporate contract. Bradley is the CEO who decided to violate federal copyright law and ignore a formal cease and desist, I said, looking directly at Bradley. He made this personal when he tried to steal my code to inflate his IPO valuation. If he has confidence in the company's future under his leadership, he should have no issue signing a personal guarantee. Bradley swallowed hard, his face turning a deep shade of red. He looked at his father, pleading with his eyes. Sign it, Bradley, Walter said, his voice flat, or I will call an emergency board meeting in 10 minutes, remove you as CEO for gross negligence, and sign it myself as the interim director. Either way, Julian gets his terms. The only question is whether you still have a job at the end of the day. With trembling hands, Bradley reached for my pen. What about the apology? He whispered. I have it drafted right here, I said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. Bradley read the statement. It was a clear, unambiguous admission of his error, acknowledging that the Nexus 127 software was my sole property and that his attempt to declare my role redundant was a pretext to illegally seize the code. He had to sign it, and it would be recorded in the corporate board minutes. With a look of pure defeat, Bradley signed the apology, then the licensing agreement, and finally the consulting contract containing the personal guarantee. Oliver Banks stamped the documents with the corporate seal and signed as a witness. Now, Bradley said, his voice barely audible, turn it back on, please. First, the payment, I said. Oliver Banks opened his laptop. The wire transfer has been initiated, Mr. Mercer. $500,000 for the first year's license, plus $16,666 for the first month of your consulting retainer. You should see the pending status in your account now. I checked my tablet. The wire transfer was pending validation. I waited 5 minutes until the screen refreshed, displaying a green checkmark next to the deposit. The funds were cleared. I stood up, walked to my workstation in the study, and sat down. Bradley, Walter, and Oliver Banks followed me, standing in the doorway. I opened the admin console of the remote verification server. I navigated to the license key table, generated a new 5-year cryptographic token, and assigned it to the Vance Logistics server IP address. I pressed the enter key. "It's done," I said. Within seconds, Bradley's phone began to vibrate. It was a call from Gary Thompson at the Savannah hub. Bradley answered, putting it on speaker. "Bradley! The screen's just turned back on," Gary shouted, his voice ecstatic. "The AGVs are moving again. The sorting belts are running at full speed. We're printing labels." Before Bradley could celebrate, his second phone rang. It was the dispatch office in Jacksonville. The GPS tracking board was back online, and the trucks at the Canadian border were already clearing customs as the ACE system accepted the updated data signatures. The digital engine of Vance Logistics had roared back to life. Walter Vance let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. He walked over to me, extending his hand. "Thank you, Julian. You've saved the company." "I saved the company from Bradley, Walter," I corrected gently, shaking his hand. "Make sure he doesn't touch the systems again." "He won't," Walter promised. "As of this moment, Harvey Fletcher is fired. I am stepping back in as the chairman of the board to personally oversee the restructuring. Bradley will remain CEO in name only, to preserve the IPO appearance, but he will have zero operational authority. Every decision he makes will go through me." Bradley stood in silence, staring at the floor. He knew his career as an independent corporate leader was over before it had even begun. The aftermath was exactly as I had planned. The Vanguard Group returned to Savannah on Wednesday. With the software licensing issues legally resolved, the due diligence audit resumed. However, because of the new $500,000 annual operating expense for the software license, the company's profit margins were adjusted. The IPO valuation was reduced from $450 million to $410 million. Bradley's dream of a massive payout was trimmed by $40 million, a direct consequence of his greed. CFO Harvey Fletcher was escorted from the building by security on Monday afternoon, his career in logistics finance effectively ruined. As for me, I transitioned into my new life as an independent consultant. I now earn $700,000 a year for doing less than 10 hours of work a week from my home office. My primary task is simply monitoring the server logs of Nexus 127 and ensuring the database integrity remains intact. Sometimes, I look back at that Friday afternoon in the boardroom. Bradley thought he was playing corporate chess, moving pieces to clear a path for his own ambition. He forgot that in the modern corporate world, the people who build the board and write the rules of the game are the ones who ultimately win. Clean code, a solid contract, and a little patience will always defeat arrogance and greed.